Part 1. The word that meant nothing. The Kalan Dominion had a word for what it did to other worlds, and the word did not mean conquest. Conquest implied a fight. It implied that somewhere, at some point, a defender had stood their ground and made the outcome uncertain, even for a moment. The Dominion's word, Sevil, meant something closer to inventory. The counting of a thing that was already, in every sense that mattered, yours. High Marshal Threx Orin had used the word for 411 worlds. He used it again on the 412th, standing on the observation deck of the dreadnought Unbroken Line, watching a planet's cities go dark one grid section at a time as the harvesting drones descended. He was not cruel. He told himself this the way a man checks his own pulse, reflexively, to confirm that the machinery underneath was still running the way it was supposed to. The Dominion did not slaughter. Slaughter was inefficient, and the Kalan had not built an empire spanning 1100 systems by being inefficient. They extracted. Populations were catalogued, sorted, and redistributed to labor colonies, breeding preserves, and, for the more cognitively flexible species, administrative subtiers where they could be made useful. Cities were stripped of anything worth stripping and left standing, empty, the way a shell is left on a beach after the animal inside has been eaten by something else. The species on the planet below called themselves the Osser. They had reached orbital flight 40 years earlier and had, in that time, built exactly one thing that impressed Threx: a set of encrypted burst transmitters that had taken his signals core almost 6 hours to crack. 6 hours was a personal best for any pre-Sevil civilization in the last century. Threx made a note of it in his private log, the way he made a note of every small thing that varied even slightly from the baseline. He had learned, over 300 years of service, that the variations were the only things worth remembering. Everything else blurred into a single long gray corridor of identical outcomes. Osser, bipedal, aquatic origin, resistance, 9 days, signal encryption, notably competent. He closed the log. Somewhere below, the Osser were making the same broadcasts every dying civilization made, to each other, to the sky, to whatever might be listening in the vast quiet dark. Nobody was listening. That was the arithmetic of the galaxy that the Dominion had proven, over and over, for 600 years. Help does not come. Distance is real. Time is real. By the time word of a harvest reached anyone who might care, the harvest was long finished and the next fleet was already 3 systems further on. The Dominion counted 1,140 star systems under direct administration. It had taken 6 centuries to build, not because the Kalan were slow, they were, by any galactic measure, extraordinarily efficient, but because space itself imposed a speed limit on ambition that no amount of competence could outrun. You could only digest so much civilization at a time, so they had started small. 1 system, then 4, then 40. The compounding did the rest, the way compounding always does, quietly, until one day you look up and you are the largest thing anyone has ever built. Threx had personally overseen 411 of those 412 harvests. He was, by a wide margin, the most decorated officer in Dominion history, and the reason for this was simple and had nothing to do with tactical brilliance. Threx had never lost. Not a battle, not a scout ship, not a single unnecessary casualty in 3 centuries of expansion. His command carried an aura that other admirals envied and other species had learned, eventually and always too late, to fear. The aura of a man for whom the outcome was never actually in question. He did not know yet that this reputation had an expiration date, and that the date had already been circled on a calendar 400 light-years away, in a small stone farmhouse that no orbital sensor in the Dominion had ever once flagged as interesting. Part 2. The ones who watched back Dr. Amaravas had been the Unified Terran Council's lead threat analyst for 11 years before she ever saw a single frame of footage of a Kalan harvesting fleet. What she had instead, for most of that decade, was silence, the specific, deliberate silence of a species that had figured out, entirely by accident, that it was being watched by something it could not survive meeting. The discovery had happened the way most important discoveries happen. Sideways, by people who weren't looking for it. A deep space listening array in the outer belt, built to catalog pulsar drift for an entirely unrelated astrophysics project, had picked up a burst of structured electromagnetic noise 38 years earlier. It took the array's automated systems 4 months to flag it as artificial. It took human analysts another 2 years to determine that the signal wasn't a message. It was residue, the electromagnetic exhaust of a fleet-scale industrial operation, bleeding faintly across a distance of 110 light-years, and structured in a way that matched nothing any human engineer had ever designed. Amara had been a junior astrophysicist then, assigned to the residue project because nobody senior thought it would go anywhere. She was the one who ran the reverse triangulation. She was the one who found the second signal and the third, each one bearing the unmistakable fingerprint of the same technology, each one marking a system that, according to every subsequent survey, no longer had a living population. She had written the first report herself at 2 a.m. at a kitchen table, with a cup of tea that went cold before she finished. She had not slept that night, or, in any real sense, for several years afterward. What followed was a decision that Amara had argued for personally and that the council had, after considerable resistance, adopted: total electromagnetic discipline. Over 8 years, human civilization had quietly throttled its own visibility. Encrypted communications shifted to tight beam laser relay, orbital infrastructure redesigned to minimize thermal bloom, deep space listening posts reoriented from broadcasting to pure reception. From the outside to anything scanning from more than a few light years out, humanity had gone from a modestly loud, modestly interesting industrial civilization to something that looked, at a glance, very much like nothing at all. It bought time. It did not buy safety. Amara had known from the start that hiding was a strategy with a shelf life, and somewhere in that first report she had written the sentence that would come to define the next 30 years of her life. We cannot outhide a civilization with 600 years of practice finding things. We can only decide what they find when they arrive. The document she produced after that, 340 pages, codenamed The Long Game, though nobody who wrote it ever called it that out loud, was not a weapons proposal. It was, in its bones, a study of empires, how they grow complacent, how doctrine calcifies into blind spot, how 6 centuries of uninterrupted success can become, itself, the single greatest vulnerability an institution can carry. The Kalan Dominion did not lose. It had never needed to develop the muscles a species needs when it might lose: vigilance against internal betrayal, paranoia about its own supply chains, the constant, exhausting discipline of checking your own house for termites. 600 years of Seville had produced a magnificent machine that had never once looked inward for a threat, because nothing that had ever been inside it had ever been a threat. Amara's proposal did not ask the council to build a bigger gun. It asked them to become termites. Interlude. The ones who said yes before there was a program, before there was even a name for it. There was a room in an unremarkable government annex outside Geneva, and 5 people who had each, independently, been quietly flagged by a recruitment algorithm that Amara Voss had designed herself and trusted to nobody else. The algorithm did not look for soldiers. Soldiers, Amara had argued in the earliest planning sessions, were exactly the wrong instrument for what she had in mind, trained to a posture of readiness that showed, in 100 small tells, to anyone who knew what to look for. What she needed instead were people who could disappear into ordinariness the way water disappears into sand. Engineers, technicians, the kind of quietly excellent, quietly overlooked professionals whose entire careers had already trained them to do exceptional work without ever needing anyone to notice. Ellen Kovac had been recruited out of a fault-tolerance research post at a fusion plant in Trieste, where her colleagues would later describe her, in the one debrief interview the program allowed itself after the fact, as the person you forgot was in the room until the thing she fixed 6 months ago quietly saved your life. Tomas Reyes had been a logistics officer for a disaster relief agency, a man who had spent a decade moving emergency supplies through collapsed infrastructure and impossible bureaucracies with a calm, unhurried thoroughness that had, more than once, kept entire refugee camps fed through winters nobody thought they'd survive. Marisol Chin had been an autonomous systems calibration specialist for an orbital debris tracking consortium, the kind of job that consisted almost entirely of noticing things nobody else had the patience to notice. The interview Amara conducted with each of them, alone in the same small room, always began with the same sentence, delivered without preamble, because she had learned early that anything gentler only wasted time and clarity that the moment badly needed. "I'm going to describe a mission to you," she told each of them in turn. "If you understand it correctly, you will not want to volunteer. I need you to volunteer anyway, and I need you to understand completely what you are agreeing to before you do." She told them everything. The outpost that would be deliberately left findable. The processing camps whose survival odds she could not honestly promise above roughly 4 in 5. The years, She did not know how many, only that it would be many, of living as someone else, inside a machine that had already swallowed 400 civilizations without ever once feeling the weight of what it had done. She told them there would be no extraction plan for at least a decade, possibly longer, because any extraction mechanism reliable enough to use would also be reliable enough for the Dominion to eventually discover. She told them that if they were caught, there would be no rescue because a rescue attempt would compromise everyone else in the program and every future version of it that might still need to exist. She told them, finally, the thing she found hardest to say out loud every time, that if the mission succeeded exactly as designed, they might spend 20 years building toward a single day, and that day might come and go so quietly that no history book would ever record their names, because the entire point was that nobody, not the Dominion, not their own government, not even, for long stretches, each other, could ever be allowed to know what they had actually done. Every one of them said yes. Not immediately. Amara had built enough silence into each interview for genuine hesitation, and every candidate had taken it, but eventually, and without exception, for reasons that varied person to person and that Amara cataloged, afterward, in a private document she never showed anyone. Ellen said yes because her grandmother had been a child during a war that had taught her family, 3 generations deep, that waiting for someone else to intervene was a bet you couldn't always win. Tomas said yes because he had spent a decade watching what happened to people when the systems meant to protect them arrived 4 days too late, and had decided, somewhere in that decade, that he would rather be early and unseen than visible and useless. Marisol said yes for a reason she gave Amara only once in a debrief years afterward that the record keepers filed and never circulated. Because somebody was going to have to notice the thing nobody else was paying attention to. That's just always been my job. The training that followed took 3 years and covered almost nothing that looked, from the outside, like preparation for war. There were no weapons drills. There was language immersion so total that trainees dreamed in Kalan syntax within 18 months. There was a psychological conditioning regimen that Dr. Renata Achebe refused, on principle, to fully document, on the grounds that the specific techniques for teaching a human mind to bury its own identity for a decade or more on command without cracking were themselves dangerous enough that she did not trust any archive, however secure, to hold them safely forever. There was, above all, an enormous, grinding amount of technical retraining, turning 5 already excellent specialists into the specific, narrow, kind of quietly indispensable laborer that an empire built on 12 billion interchangeable hands would never think twice about promoting. None of them were told, until the very end, exactly what the others' individual roles would eventually become. Compartmentalization, Amara had insisted, was not paranoia. It was mercy. A person who does not know the full shape of the plan cannot be broken into revealing it. And, though she never said this part aloud to any of them, a person carrying only their own piece of an unbearable weight has, however slightly, an easier weight to carry. Part 3. The program with no name. It took 4 years to convince the council. It took another 6 to build the infrastructure, and 11 more to run it. Officially, the effort had no single designation. That was the point. Compartmentalized across 19 separate agency codenames, cross-referenced nowhere, briefed to fewer than 40 people at any given time, it existed mostly as a shape in Amara Voss's head and in the heads of the small circle of planners who had signed on to make that shape real. The people who lived inside it, eventually, had their own word for it, passed quietly between them in the rare moments they could speak freely. They called it the quiet hand. The premise was almost embarrassingly simple, in the way the best strategies always are once someone has already thought of them. The Dominion's harvesting doctrine required contact before conquest, scout ships, sensor sweeps, sometimes small preliminary landings to catalog a species before the main fleet arrived. And in 600 years of practice, the Dominion's contact protocol had developed exactly one blind spot: the harvested. Every conquered species eventually produced laborers. Laborers moved. They were shipped between systems, reassigned to fill gaps in the Dominion's endlessly hungry logistics apparatus, sorted by aptitude into technical and maintenance roles wherever a species proved capable enough to be worth training rather than simply working to exhaustion. A skilled laborer from a harvested world might spend a decade as a hull technician on a supply tender, then be reassigned to a fuel depot, then to a shipyard, moving deeper and deeper into the Dominion's operational bloodstream. Not because anyone was watching them do it, but because nobody was watching them at all. Laborers were furniture. Furniture did not get audited. The quiet hand's first and only field asset was not a ship. It was a person, and then, slowly, a small handful of people, and the method by which they entered Dominion space was the ugliest and most carefully engineered part of the entire program. A border research outpost, 3 light-years past the edge of officially charted human territory, deliberately left running, deliberately staffed, deliberately findable, the day the Council's long-range listening posts confirmed a Dominion scout pattern sweeping toward that exact sector. The outpost had 6 live personnel aboard when the scout found it. All 6 had volunteered for the posting fully aware of what it was. All 6 had spent the preceding 3 years training for a life they hoped to never actually need, cover identities, technical trades useful to an industrial empire, and a psychological preparation regimen that the mission's lead psychologist, Dr. Renata Achebe, had refused to fully describe in writing, because some things, she said, should not exist as a document that could be found. The scout ship reported the outpost as an unremarkable pre-civil research station, staffed by a newly discovered species of negligible resistance value. The Dominion's standard procedure for such finds was not immediate harvest but processing. The population was catalogued, assessed for labor aptitude, and folded into the nearest labor rotation pool. 5 of the 6 humans were sorted within 18 months into technical maintenance tracks. The 6th did not survive the initial processing camp, a fact that the mission's planners had known was a mathematical possibility going in, and that none of them, including Amara, ever discussed again in anything but the driest procedural language because the alternative was to stop being able to function at all. The 5 who survived carried nothing incriminating. They carried nothing at all except patience, training, and an absolute bone-deep understanding of what they were there to eventually do. Part 4. 22 years of being nobody. Her name on the manifests was Priya Anand 7734, labor designation, fabrication technician, 3rd tier. Nobody in the Dominion's 12 billion-strong labor apparatus had any reason to know that this designation had once belonged to a woman named Ellen Kovac, formerly of the Unified Terran Council's Engineering Corps, and that Ellen Kovac had spent 3 years learning to answer to a different name in her sleep before she ever set foot on the outpost that would deliver her into Dominion custody. Ellen's specialty, in the life she'd left behind, had been fault-tolerant reactor architecture, the deep, unglamorous science of how power systems fail and how to make sure they don't. It was, by design, exactly the kind of expertise the Dominion's labor sorters valued in a newly processed species, useful, teachable, and utterly beneath the notice of anyone who mattered. For 4 years she scrubbed conduits on a mining tender in the outer processing ring, watched, learned, and said nothing. For 6 years after that she worked reactor maintenance on a supply corvette, one of the thousands of unglamorous vessels that kept the Dominion's war machine fed, fueled, and moving. She learned the Kalan language not from a classroom but from 12 years of overheard technical briefings, safety manuals, and the particular board profanity of engineers everywhere, in every species, when a valve sticks at the worst possible moment. She was good at her job. This was not incidental, it was the entire strategy. A laborer who was merely adequate got rotated, reassigned, lost in the churn. A laborer who was excellent got noticed by supervisors looking to fill gaps in their own overworked technical staff, and excellence, applied patiently and without any hint of ambition beyond craftsmanship, was the only kind of visibility that didn't get you killed. By year 14, Ellen, designated Priya Anand 7734, had been promoted, through the unglamorous, grinding logic of institutional competence, to senior fabrication technician aboard a fleet resupply station called Cradle 9, one of 11 such stations responsible for servicing, provisioning, and refueling the Dominion's frontline battle fleets before major operations. It was, in the plain arithmetic of the Dominion's own bureaucracy, one of the most sensitive technical postings a non-Kalan laborer could hold, and nobody in the chain of command that had approved her transfer had thought about it for longer than the 4 seconds it took to read her service record and nod. She was not alone. 2 of the other 4 survivors from the original outpost had, through equally patient and unglamorous climbs, found their way into comparable postings, one in fleet logistics coordination, tracking fuel shipments and maintenance schedules across an entire operational sector, one in orbital drone control calibration, the deeply technical, deeply boring discipline of keeping a battle fleet's automated defense systems correctly tuned. The 4th had died of an illness in year 9, quietly, the way people simply do sometimes, and the quiet hands planners back on Earth had received the news 11 months later, through a relay chain so slow and so cautious it made grief itself feel like a tactical problem to be managed. 22 years. That was how long it took, in total, From the day the outpost was discovered to the day the 4 remaining pieces of the plan were finally, quietly, all in position. 22 years of being furniture. 22 years of speaking a second language in your sleep, of flinching at nothing, of watching colleagues you'd worked beside for a decade get reassigned or retired or simply vanish into the enormous churn of an empire that ran on 12 billion interchangeable hands, and never once letting your face show that you had noticed or cared or remembered their names in a private ledger nobody would ever see. Ellen Kovac turned 51 the year the Dominion's Long-Range Survey Command finally logged what it had been circling for decades. A quiet, industrially developed system in a previously unremarkable sector, electromagnetic signature suppressed almost to the point of invisibility, designation pending. The system's local inhabitants called it, in the dominant tongue of 90% of its population, a short, blunt word: Earth. High Marshal Threx Oren's fleet was ordered to investigate within the year. Part 4.5. The night someone almost saw it happened in year 16 on Cradle 9, 11 months before the fleet toward Earth was ever ordered, and it was, in the entire 22 years, the single closest any of them came to being caught. A junior Kalan inspection officer named Vesendral, newly assigned to fleet compliance and eager in the specific, dangerous way of officers who have not yet learned which questions are safe to ask, had pulled Ellen's maintenance logs for a routine cross-audit. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because Dral was building a case for promotion and had decided that a thorough audit of an under-scrutinized technical department would look good on a service record. He found, buried in 11 years of otherwise flawless documentation, a pattern he could not quite name but did not like: containment calibration settings that were individually each within tolerance, but that drifted cumulatively session after session, year after year in a single consistent direction. It was the kind of thing that meant nothing to an automated system built to flag single-session anomalies, and everything to a person patient enough and paranoid enough to plot 11 years of data on a single graph. Dral requested an in-person interview. Ellen received the request 4 hours before the meeting, through the station's ordinary internal messaging system, with no warning beyond the routine, bureaucratic phrasing every laborer on the station received a dozen times a year for a dozen mundane reasons. She read it twice, standing in the corridor outside her bunk, and felt something she had trained for 11 years to control arrive anyway. The specific animal cold of a plan that might, in the next hour, simply end. She did not contact anyone. There was no one to contact. That had always been the design, the thing Amara had told her plainly in the very first interview. If discovery came, it would come alone, and it would have to be survived or not alone. What saved her was not luck, though she would spend years afterward, in the privacy of her own head, unable to fully separate the two. It was the same quality that had gotten her the posting in the first place. An 11-year record of being, in every other respect, the single most reliable, most unremarkable, most quietly competent technician in her entire department. When Dral sat across from her in a windowless compliance office and laid out his graph, the drift, plotted year over year, undeniable once you saw it. Ellen did the only thing available to her that had any chance of working. She agreed with him immediately, entirely, and without a flicker of the fear she was carrying. "You're right," she told him, in Kalan fluent enough by then that the words came without any conscious translation at all. "I've been compensating for a manufacturing tolerance issue in the third-generation containment housings. It's a known defect class, documented in the original specification addenda, Section 11. Correcting it fully would require taking the reactor offline for recalibration, which Fleet Command has twice declined to authorize during active deployment cycles, so I've been managing the drift manually instead, within safe limits, to avoid forcing an unscheduled shutdown." She had built this exact cover story 4 years earlier, in the quiet, patient way she built everything, on the chance that exactly this conversation might one day happen. "I should have flagged it more clearly in my own notes. That's a fair criticism. It was not, technically, a lie. Section 11 of the specification addenda did describe a real, documented tolerance issue in third-generation containment housings. Ellen had spent months finding it, specifically because she needed a true fact large enough to hide a false one behind. Dral, faced with an answer that was both plausible and, when he checked it 2 days later, technically accurate, filed his audit as resolved. A known engineering issue, competently if imperfectly managed by a conscientious technician who had, if anything, been slightly too cautious in her own documentation. He was promoted 8 months later, on the strength of an audit record that listed, among its findings, the identification and resolution of a minor but persistent technical anomaly. He never learned what he had actually found. Ellen never told anyone, for 11 more years, how close it had come. Not Tomas, not Marisol, not even until her final debrief, Amara Voss herself, who read the account afterward in complete silence and then closed the file and did not open it again for a long time. Part 5. The fleet that was coming anyway. Threx read the survey report during his morning meal and set it aside before finishing his food, the way he had done with 411 reports before it. A quiet system, suppressed emissions, moderate industrial capacity, unclear resistance profile. Standard procedure called for a scout sweep followed by a full fleet harvest operation within 18 months of confirmed contact. He did not know that a woman he would never meet, 3 transfer postings and 1 alias removed from the Cradle 9 fuel bay he had personally certified for operational readiness 11 years earlier, had spent the last decade quietly documenting the precise tolerances, failure points, and maintenance blind spots of the exact class of antimatter containment core that powered his own flagship's reactor. He did not know that a man named Tomas Reyes, designated on Dominion manifests as Van UR 2210 Senior Logistics Coordinator, had spent 9 years building 1 authorized fuel requisition at a time, 1 perfectly ordinary supply manifest at a time. A detailed operational map of exactly which ships in exactly which order would be refueled, rearmed, and dispatched toward whatever system the Dominion's next major harvest target turned out to be. He did not know that Marisol Chen, designated Felamara 1108 drone calibration specialist, had spent 6 years quietly, incrementally, adjusting the failure tolerances on an entire sector's automated point defense grid by margins so small that no single audit had ever flagged them, margins that meant nothing at all until the specific engineered moment when they would mean everything. He did not know any of this because none of it was designed to be known. That was the entire brutal elegance of the thing Amara Voss had built in a farmhouse kitchen 30 years earlier. A weapon made of nothing but time, patience, and the specific vulnerability of an empire that had never once needed to ask whether the hands maintaining its ships could be trusted, because in 600 years, they always had been. Threx set the survey report aside, finished his meal, and gave the order that would, without his knowledge, put his own flagship on a fueling and resupply schedule managed in no small part by people his own empire had processed, catalogued, and forgotten. He called it, in his log, a standard operation. It was the 413th and the last of his career. Part 6. 18 months. The quiet hands activation window was not a single moment. It was 18 months of accumulating invisible pressure, a slow tightening of 1,000 small screws, each one individually meaningless, each one authorized by someone with the legitimate technical standing to authorize it, none of them ever cross-referenced against each other because no single Dominion oversight system had ever been built to imagine that they might need to be. Ellen's contribution began first, and took the longest because it required the most patience. Antimatter containment cores did not fail suddenly if you wanted them to fail usefully. A sudden catastrophic failure was a bomb, dramatic, visible, and, worse, instantly diagnosable by any competent engineer who happened to survive it, which would compromise every other laborer quietly embedded in every other Dominion facility across the Empire. What Ellen built instead, across 11 years of patient, entirely within tolerance maintenance work, was a drift, a set of containment field calibrations so close to specification that no automated system would ever flag them, and so precisely, deliberately imperfect that the drift would only compound into failure under one specific condition: sustained high-output stress, the kind of stress a reactor experienced only during a full fleet-scale offensive engagement. Tomas's contribution was logistical and, in its own way, almost farcical in its simplicity. He made sure that when the fleet mobilized, the ships carrying Ellen's compromised containment cores were dispatched in the first wave, at the front of the formation, closest to whatever the fleet was sent to engage. Marisol's contribution activated last and fastest. The point defense grid's tolerance drift she'd spent 6 years building meant that when the moment came, the automated systems responsible for detecting and neutralizing internal reactor anomalies would be running at just enough of a lag, milliseconds, nothing more, to miss the earliest, most survivable stage of containment failure, and only catch it once the failure had progressed too far to reverse. None of it, on its own, was sabotage in any sense a Dominion auditor would recognize. Each piece was a maintenance decision within acceptable parameters, made by a trusted, long-serving technician, on a system so vast that no single ship's failure would ever be traced back through 11 years of individually defensible choices to a conspiracy. That was the design. That had always been the design. Amara Voss had written it into the long game 3 decades earlier, in a sentence she'd underlined twice, "We do not need to win a battle. We need the Dominion to lose confidence in its own machine." The fleet that departed for human space numbered 61 capital ships and their escorts, smaller than the 411 that had preceded it, because Threx Orin had never needed more than that to guarantee an outcome, and had never once been wrong. Part 7. The fleet that died quietly. The Dominion fleet crossed into human-charted space on what human calendars called a Thursday, a fact that meant nothing to anyone aboard the 61 ships and everything to the handful of people on Earth who had, for reasons none of them could fully articulate, insisted on tracking the date anyway. Threx brought his fleet in at standard approach velocity, sensors active, formation tight, exactly as doctrine prescribed for a first contact with an industrially developed but unknown resistance profile. He expected, based on 600 years of precedent, either token resistance followed by capitulation, or, in the rare, interesting cases, a brief, costly, ultimately futile show of force before the inevitable harvest began. What he did not expect, for hours into the approach, was the first containment alert. It began on the Solace Bearer, a support cruiser near the front of his formation, the exact position Tomas Reyes had spent 9 years quietly ensuring it would occupy. A containment fluctuation flagged by onboard diagnostics as within acceptable tolerance, exactly as it had been flagged as within tolerance for the 11 years since Ellen Kovac had first touched that reactor's calibration settings. Then a second fluctuation, sharper. Then, 6 minutes later, catastrophic failure, not an explosion so much as a controlled, terrible unraveling, the reactor's containment field simply ceasing to exist in the specific patient way that 11 years of accumulated drift had made not merely possible but, under sustained engagement stress, essentially guaranteed. The Solace Bearer did not explode instantly. It had time to broadcast a distress signal, time for its crew to attempt an emergency shutdown that failed because the diagnostic systems reporting the failure state were themselves running on the exact millisecond lag that Marisol Chin had spent 6 years building into the sector's automated response grid. By the time the crew understood what was actually happening to their ship, there was nothing left to do about it. Threx watched the first ship die on his tactical display and felt, for the first time in 3 centuries, the specific vertigo of an event his mind had no ready category for. A reactor failure was not unheard of. Ships aged, systems degraded, accidents happened even in the most disciplined fleet. But a reactor failure occurring in the exact ship positioned at the leading edge of a first contact approach, at the exact moment his fleet crossed into contested space, with no external weapons fire, no detected enemy vessel, nothing at all except his own machine quietly, inexplicably coming apart from the inside, that was not an accident. That was a pattern, and Threx Orin had built an entire career on his ability to recognize patterns before anyone else in the room. "Pull the fleet back," he said. "Full stop. All ships, halt approach and run full diagnostic sweeps immediately." It was, in its own way, already too late. The order to halt meant the fleet held position for the diagnostic sweeps, and holding position, running systems at standby rather than active combat load, was precisely the condition under which Ellen's carefully engineered drift stopped matching, because the stress collapse she'd built was designed to trigger under sustained high-output strain. It should have been safe now. It should have stopped. In the 4 hours between the Solace Bearer's first containment fluctuation and Threx's order to halt approach, the bridge of the unbroken line went through a transformation none of its officers would ever describe accurately in any later report, because Dominion military culture had no vocabulary for what it felt like to watch certainty die in real time. Officer Ilv, Threx's second for the better part of 2 decades, had stood beside him through 300 engagements and had never once seen him ask a question he did not already know the answer to. In those 4 hours, she counted 17. "Confirm no external contact," he said, for the 3rd time, to a sensor officer who had already confirmed it twice. "Confirm nothing entered the formation. Confirm no vessel, no drone, no projectile crossed our perimeter in the last 6 hours. Confirmed, Admiral. Nothing crossed the perimeter. Nothing left the formation. Nothing arrived." "Then explain to me," Threx said, and his voice carried, for the only time in Ilv's memory of him, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear but sat, uncomfortably, in the narrow space between the two. "How a Dominion warship, serviced by Dominion engineers, fueled at a Dominion depot, crewed by Dominion personnel, simply comes apart in open space with no cause anyone in this fleet can name." Nobody answered because nobody could, and the silence that followed was the exact, specific silence of 600 years of institutional certainty meeting, For the first time, a problem it had no framework to solve. It did not stop because the solace bearer's death had done something none of the quiet hands planners had fully anticipated in their models. It had triggered a fleet-wide, doctrine-mandated precautionary reactor stress test. Full diagnostic load run on every capital ship simultaneously, the standard Dominion procedure after any unexplained catastrophic failure, designed specifically to catch a systemic flaw before it could spread. The stress test put every reactor in the fleet under exactly the sustained high-output load that 11 years of Ellen Kovac's patient, deniable maintenance work had been quietly, invisibly tuning them to fail under. The second ship died 4 minutes later. The third 90 seconds after that. By the time Threx understood what his own precautionary safety procedure had actually done, 7 ships were reporting containment fluctuations, and there was no order left to give that would not make things worse because every possible response, hold position, disengage, run diagnostics, power down, required exactly the kind of reactor load cycling that the drift had been built patiently over more than a decade to fail under. Emergency reactor shutdown. Fleet-wide. Threx ordered, his voice, for the first time in the memory of anyone on his bridge, not entirely steady. Non-essential systems only. Minimum power. Now, it worked in the sense that it stopped the dying. 9 ships were lost before the fleet reached a stable minimum power state. 9 ships out of 61, destroyed not by an enemy weapon, not by a fleet they had never actually engaged, not by anything Threx's sensors had ever detected as hostile, but by a failure his own logs would eventually, mortifyingly, have to record as originating entirely within his own vessels. He did not know, and would never know, the names Ellen Kovac, Tomas Reyes, or Marisol Chen. He did not know that somewhere aboard Cradle 9, a fuel resupply station 4 systems behind his failing fleet, a woman his own empire had processed as an unremarkable laborer 22 years earlier was, at that exact moment, sitting perfectly still at her workstation, watching a status board that meant nothing to anyone around her and everything to her, and feeling something she had not let herself feel in over 2 decades. The beginning of an ending. Part 8. The message that needed no weapon. Amara Voss received the confirmation at 3:14 in the morning, on a secured relay channel that had taken the signal 11 days to travel from the edge of contested space to her desk on Earth. She had been asleep badly, the way she had slept badly for most of the last 30 years. She read the message twice before she let herself believe it. Fleet engagement confirmed. 9 capital ships lost, no human casualties, no human vessel engaged. Fleet withdrawing. Assets Kovac, Reyes, Chun confirmed alive and undetected. Requesting further instruction. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table in the same small house where she had written the long game 3 decades earlier, and thought about the specific, terrible elegance of what had actually happened 4 systems away. There had been no battle. No human had fired a shot or stood in a trench or died defending a wall. An empire that had harvested 412 worlds through overwhelming, uncontested force had just lost 9 capital ships to a woman with a fabrication technician's toolkit and 11 years of patience, and it would never, in any report Threx Oren filed, be able to honestly write down what had actually destroyed them because the true answer, we did this to ourselves and did not know it for over a decade, was not an answer any Dominion officer had the institutional vocabulary to write. That, Amara understood, sitting at her table with tea going cold at her elbow exactly as it had 30 years before, was the actual weapon. Not the 9 ships. The doubt. An empire that could no longer fully trust its own maintenance logs, its own labor pool, its own 600-year certainty that the machine simply worked because it always had. A doubt that could not be repaired by building a bigger fleet, because the vulnerability wasn't in the fleet. It was in the assumption that had let the fleet exist unquestioned for 6 centuries. That a harvested people, once processed, once sorted, once made useful, stopped being a variable and became simply a tool. She picked up her communicator and sent a single instruction back down the 11-day relay chain, to 3 people she had never met in person and might now, after this, finally have a chance to. Hold position. Do not extract. Let them come to their own conclusions first. We are not done. We are just beginning to be believed. Part 9. What an Empire Does with Doubt. Threx Oren's official report, filed 6 weeks after the withdrawal, from a debriefing chamber on the Dominion homeworld that smelled. He noted with the specific numb clarity of a man in genuine shock, exactly like every other debriefing chamber he had ever sat in for 300 years, contained a sentence that no officer in Dominion history had ever previously written. Cause of catastrophic fleet loss: undetermined. Sabotage cannot be ruled out. Sabotage cannot be confirmed. No hostile contact was made. No hostile vessel was detected. The failure originated from within our own logistics and maintenance apparatus, across multiple ships, multiple systems, and, pending full audit, potentially multiple years of undetected preparation. The sentence that followed it was the one that would, in the months and years to come, do more damage to the Dominion than any single lost battle in 6 centuries of expansion. If this was deliberate, then any laborer in any facility, processed from any harvested world, over any period of years, must now be considered a potential unverified operational risk. A full audit of all labor-integrated technical and logistics postings across the Dominion is recommended. It was Amara Voss would later write in a private addendum to the long game that only a handful of people would ever read, the single most devastating sentence any human being had caused to be written in the history of the conflict. Not because it was a lie, but because it was, in its narrow, technical way, entirely true, and because an empire built on the labor of 412 harvested civilizations could not act on that truth without effectively declaring war on its own foundations. The audit Threx recommended was, in fact, ordered. Took years. It found nothing conclusive because Ellen, Tomas, and Marisol had, on Amara's explicit instruction, gone dormant the moment the fleet withdrew. No further sabotage, no further contact. Nothing at all except 3 ordinary laborers doing ordinary, excellent work, exactly as they had for 2 decades. But the audit's failure to find anything was, in its own way, worse for Dominion morale than finding something would have been. An empire that audits 12 billion laborers across 1,100 systems and finds nothing is not an empire that feels reassured. It is an empire that has just discovered it has no reliable way of ever knowing, and that discovery does not go away when the audit ends. It sits quietly underneath every subsequent decision, the way a single cracked support beam sits underneath a building that otherwise looks, from every angle, entirely fine. The Dominion did not send another fleet toward human space. Not because it could no longer win such an engagement in any straightforward tactical sense. 61 ships were, after all, still 61 ships, and the Dominion had thousands more. It did not send another fleet because Threx Oren's official report, filed and archived and referenced by every subsequent strategic planning committee for the next generation, had done exactly what Amara Voss had designed it 30 years earlier to do. It had planted a single, unresolvable, structurally corrosive question inside the machine. Can we still trust the hands that build our ships? No amount of firepower answers that question. Can only be lived with, worked around, or eventually negotiated away. Part 10. The negotiation nobody announced it took 4 more years, after the withdrawal, for a small, unmarked Dominion diplomatic vessel to appear at the edge of human-charted space, broadcasting on open frequencies a specific harmonic pulse that the Dominion had, in 600 years, used perhaps a dozen times, always between established powers, never once with a species it had catalogued as pre-civil. Amara Voss did not attend the negotiations herself. She was 68 by then, and had spent enough of her life sitting in rooms holding her breath. She sent, instead, a small team led by a diplomat named Idris Okonkwo, who had spent the preceding decade studying every fragment of Dominion communication protocol that the quiet hands embedded assets had managed to smuggle out over the years, and who understood, with a clarity Amara found genuinely reassuring, that the goal was never going to be an apology. They will never say they were wrong, Idris told the negotiating team, the night before the first session. Their entire civilization is built on a story about themselves that doesn't have room for being wrong. We're not here to make them say it. We're here to make sure it doesn't matter whether they say it. The first session was held aboard a neutral relay station 3 light-years outside human-charted space, a choice the Dominion insisted on and Idris privately welcomed, since it meant the Kalan delegation would spend the entire negotiation slightly unsettled by the sheer fact that humans had agreed, calmly, to meet them anywhere at all. The Dominion's lead negotiator, a civil administrator named Corvain Issa who had spent 4 decades managing the bureaucratic aftermath of conquest rather than the conquest itself, opened the first session with a prepared statement that ran 19 minutes and used the word civil exactly once, near the end, in a context so carefully hedged that Idris's translator flagged it afterward as possibly the closest thing to an acknowledgement this delegation is capable of producing. Idris did not respond to the speech directly. He let the silence after it run 4 full seconds longer than was comfortable, a technique Amara had taught him personally years before in a much smaller room. "We're not here to discuss the past," he said finally. "We're here to discuss the boundary and what happens on either side of it. Everything else is a conversation for a different century." It was, by design, the opening move of 2 years of extraordinarily grinding, extraordinarily patient argument. The fourth session collapsed entirely when the Dominion delegation attempted to frame the containment failures at the edge of human space as an unresolved engineering matter still under Dominion internal investigation, implicitly reserving the right to revisit the incident, and by extension human territory, once that investigation concluded. Idris ended the session by standing, thanking the delegation for their time, and leaving, a gamble that took 3 weeks to pay off, during which nobody on the human side slept especially well, until a second, quieter approach came through the same neutral relay station requesting resumption of talks without precondition. The seventh session was the one Idris would later describe, in his own eventual memoir, as the day the shape of the whole agreement finally became visible. Corvain Issa, worn down by 6 months of a negotiation her own government had clearly expected to conclude in weeks, finally asked the question Idris had been waiting 2 years to be asked. "What is it you actually believe happened to our fleet?" she said, through the translator, in a tone that had lost most of its earlier formality. Off the record, administrator to administrator. Idris had rehearsed this moment more than any other part of the negotiation, because he understood, as Amara had understood decades earlier, at a kitchen table with cold tea, that the true answer was the only weapon that would ever matter, and that it could only be fired once, in exactly the right room at exactly the right moment. "I believe," he said, "that you built an empire on the assumption that a harvested people become tools the moment you finish processing them. I believe that assumption has been true for you for 112 times. And I believe that somewhere inside your own machine right now, today, there may be people who are not tools at all, and you have no way of knowing which ones, and you never will because the entire design was built so that you couldn't. That's not an accusation, administrator. It's an inventory. You're very good at those." Corvain Issa did not respond to that for a long time. When she did, it was not to deny it. It was to ask quietly what humanity actually wanted, which was the question Idris had been waiting 2 years to finally be asked honestly, and which he answered simply. The boundary, the repatriation clause, and nothing else, because, he told her and meant it, humanity had no interest in becoming the thing it had spent 30 years learning to survive. What emerged 11 sessions and 2 years later was not total victory. Idris had never expected total victory, and had said so, bluntly, in every internal briefing from the very first day. What emerged was a boundary, a specific, mutually acknowledged line beyond which the Dominion agreed, in language stiff enough to satisfy their own institutional pride, not to conduct harvesting operations, surveys, or unauthorized settlement without negotiated agreement. Buried inside the same agreement, in a clause the Dominion's negotiators clearly regarded as a minor technical concession and that Idris Okonkwo regarded, privately, as the single most important sentence in the entire document, was a provision allowing for the voluntary repatriation of displaced labor populations upon verified request. It was the mechanism, quiet and bureaucratic and utterly unglamorous, by which Ellen Kovac, Tomas Reyes, and Marisol Chen, the only 3 of the original 5 who had survived 26 years of being nobody, finally came home. Part 11. What Reddy actually looks like. Ellen Kovac stepped off a transport shuttle onto Earth's soil for the first time in 26 years on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, wearing clothes that had been prepared for her by a debriefing team that had, with what she found to be an almost unbearable tenderness, tried to guess at what a woman gone a quarter-century might want to wear home and gotten it only slightly wrong. Amara Voss was there to meet her, 81 years old by then, walking with a cane she pretended not to need. Neither woman had ever spoken to the other directly in 26 years. Every instruction, every report, had passed through 11-day relay chains and a half-dozen intermediaries who existed specifically so that neither end of the chain could compromise the other if caught. They stood, for a long moment, simply looking at each other, 2 women who had spent most of their adult lives building and executing the same quiet, patient, unglamorous plan from opposite ends of a war that had never once looked like a war. "I read your report," Amara said finally. "All 26 years of it. Every one of your maintenance logs." "They were very boring," Ellen said. "That was rather the point." "I know." Amara's smile was small, and old, and entirely real. It's the best writing I've ever read. They did not talk about the Solace Bearer or the 9 ships, or the specific weight of having spent 11 years quietly, deliberately building a failure into machinery you serviced with your own hands every single day, knowing that when it finally worked, people, however alien, however complicit in a 600-year atrocity, would still, in the end, die because of choices you made alone, in silence, with nobody to tell you whether you were doing the right thing. Ellen would, in the years that followed, write her own account of those 26 years, much as Rosa Vega's counterpart in a different telling of humanity's survival once had, a document that dwelled mostly on the mundane, the specific loneliness of speaking a second language in her sleep, the ordinary kindness of Dominion colleagues who had no idea what she was, and who she had, in some cases, genuinely liked, and the particular hollow ache of never once being able to tell a single living person for over 2 decades who she actually was. The last line of that document, when she finally wrote it, echoed something Amara had said to her, once, in the earliest days of training, 30 years before any of it began. We were never going to outfight them. We were only ever going to outweight them. There is a difference. It just takes longer to see. The Dominion still existed at the end of it. It was still vast, still powerful, still carrying the weight of 6 centuries and 412 harvested worlds that no boundary agreement and no quiet sabotage could ever give back what had been taken from them. But the advance had stopped, not because of a fleet, not because of a weapon anyone could point a sensor at, not because of a single dramatic battle broadcast to a listening galaxy. It had stopped because a handful of people had let themselves be taken, had lived 26 years as nobody, had waited with a patience that had no name in any language but their own, and had been, when the moment finally came, ready. There is a difference between hiding and waiting. It took 26 years, and it took almost nobody noticing at all, for the rest of the galaxy to finally learn it. Epilogue. What they built instead of a statue, there is no monument to the quiet hand anywhere on Earth. This was, in the end, a deliberate choice, made jointly by the 3 surviving operatives and ratified, after some debate, by the unified Terran Council, on the grounds that a monument would have to explain itself, and the explanation, that the survival of the species had depended, in the end, on ordinary people disappearing into an atrocity for a quarter century so that nobody would ever notice them, was not a story that lent itself to bronze. What exists instead, quietly, in a training curriculum that every subsequent generation of Terran deep-cover technical specialist has studied for 2 generations since, is a short document that Ellen Kovac wrote in the 2 years after her return, when sleep still came badly and she found that writing, of all things, was the only task that made the nights shorter rather than longer. It was not a strategy manual. It contained almost no tactical detail at all. It was mostly an account of the ordinary. The particular quality of a Kalan engineer's laugh at a joke that did not entirely translate, the specific ache of watching a colleague she had worked beside for 9 years get reassigned to a labor colony she knew, from documents she was never supposed to see, had a survival rate she could not bear to calculate, and the long, aching, unresolved question of whether the friendships she had built inside the Dominion's machine had been real, in any sense that mattered, given everything she had never been able to tell the people living inside them. She never fully answered that question, not in the document, not in the years that followed. She wrote, instead, near the end, a sentence that Amara Voss had quietly insisted be preserved in the official record exactly as written, unedited, because she believed, and said so, in the one internal memo she ever wrote about the document, that it was the only sentence in 30 years of planning documents, briefings, and threat assessments that actually explained why any of it had worked. I do not know if what I felt for the people I worked beside for 26 years was real. I have decided that it does not matter whether it was real in the way they believed it was. It was real enough to make me careful. It was real enough that when the moment came, I did the smallest amount of harm the mission would allow, and not one measure more. Perhaps that is the only kind of real that survives a war like this one. I have made my peace with it being enough. Tomas Reyes returned to logistics work, eventually, for a disaster relief agency much like the one he had left 30 years earlier, and told almost no one, for the rest of his life, what he had actually done in the years in between. Marisol Chun took a position training the first generation of the Quiet Hands institutional successors, a program that existed now with a name, a budget line, and an oversight committee, though its methods, curiously, changed very little from the ones Amara Voss had improvised in a farmhouse kitchen decades before. She told her trainees every year on the first day the same thing Amara had once told her. "You will not be remembered for this," she said. "That is not a flaw in the plan. That is the plan. If you need to be remembered, this is not the work for you." Amara Voss died at 91, 17 years after the boundary agreement was signed, having lived long enough to see the first Dominion trade delegation arrive under the treaty's slower, later provisions for limited economic contact, a development she had not predicted, had not planned for, and found in her last years quietly and enormously satisfying anyway, precisely because it meant the boundary had held long enough to become ordinary. Ordinary, she told Idris Okonkwo once, near the end was the entire goal. Nobody writes songs about a threat that simply stopped mattering. That was, she said, rather the point of the whole thing. The Dominion, for its part, never fully closed its internal audit into the events at the edge of human space. It could not, in the end, without unraveling 6 centuries of institutional certainty that it had never had the appetite to survive unraveling. The audit sat, instead, unresolved, in an archive on the Kalan homeworld, one label among a great many, and every subsequent generation of Dominion strategic planner who pulled that file away learned, without ever being told outright, the one lesson the file was quietly built to teach: that an empire which had never once needed to look for a threat inside its own machine had, for 26 years, been carrying one anyway, and had never known it, and could never again be entirely sure it wasn't still true. That uncertainty, more than any boundary line on any treaty, was the actual wall around human space. It did not need to be patrolled. It did not need a fleet. It needed only to exist quietly, in the back of every Dominion admiral's mind, for exactly as long as it took the rest of the galaxy to stop believing the Kalan Dominion was the kind of empire nothing could ever touch. It took 600 years of easy conquest, and 26 years of 5 ordinary people being nobody at all, for that belief to finally, quietly come apart.